Kayla Jackson sat in the third row of Mrs. Adams's English class, watching sunlight catch the delicate pattern of her teacher's dress. While other students dozed through Shakespeare analysis, Kayla found herself studying the way Mrs. Adams moved with such certainty, such grace, everything Kayla hoped to become. "That dress is beautiful, Mrs. Adams," Kayla said after class, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "The pattern reminds me of my grandmother's quilts." The compliment hung in the air. Mrs. Adams's smile flickered with surprise, then warmth, then something more complex, uncertainty, perhaps even guilt. Later, she would confess to her husband how that simple observation had shaken her. "I've been teaching these kids for 10 years. How many of them have I really seen?" For Kayla, the interaction sparked both hope and anxiety. Her best friend Jamila's reaction was immediate. "Girl, you know how white teachers get when we notice them as actual people." But Kayla couldn't forget the genuine connection she'd felt. The next day, tension erupted during class discussion. Brad Thompson, quarterback and self-appointed class clown, made a joke about black students and Shakespeare. The laughter that followed felt like glass breaking. Jamila stood up, chairs scraping loud against linoleum. "You think that's funny? You think our existence is your punchline?" Her voice shook with controlled fury. Mrs. Adams froze, textbook half-raised. Years of training hadn't prepared her for this moment. She watched her classroom splinter along racial lines. White students shifting uncomfortably, students of color radiating silent support for Jamila. "Perhaps," Mrs. Adams said finally, "we need to discuss more than just Shakespeare." She set down the textbook, sensing a turning point. "Let's talk about voice. Who gets to speak, who gets heard, and why?" Kayla felt her heart race. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, though she hadn't known it. She raised her hand, ignoring the whispers around her. "I have an idea for a project," she began. "What if we all shared our stories? Not just what Shakespeare tells us about life, but what our own lives tell us." The suggestion rippled through the classroom. Some students rolled their eyes, others sat straighter. Mrs. Adams studied Kayla with new appreciation, recognizing the courage it took to speak up. "Go on," she encouraged, even as doubt gnawed at her. Was she equipped to handle the conversations this might unleash? But looking at Kayla's determined face, she knew they had to try. The Share Your Story project launched with mixed reactions. While some students embraced the opportunity, others resisted fiercely. Brad and his friends made theatrical gagging sounds during planning sessions. A few parents called the school, concerned about political agendas in English class. Kayla and Jamila worked tirelessly, creating presentation guidelines that would help students feel safe sharing vulnerable truths. During lunch breaks, they discovered their own stories intertwining in unexpected ways. "My mom nearly lost her job for wearing braids to work," Jamila confided. "They called it unprofessional. That's why I straighten my hair every morning, even though it burns my scalp." Kayla shared her own struggles. The weight of being the only black girl in advanced classes, the constant pressure to prove she belonged. "Sometimes I feel like every word I say represents my entire race." Mrs. Adams observed their dedication while wrestling with her own revelations. She began noticing patterns she'd overlooked for years. How she called on white students more frequently, how she unconsciously policed black students' tone and language more strictly. The project's first presentation day arrived with crackling tension. Sarah Chin spoke about being told to go back to China despite being born in Dallas. Marcus Rodriguez described translating for his parents at doctor's appointments since age 6. Each story peeled back layers of assumed normalcy, revealing the complex tapestry of student experiences. Then Brad disrupted Tommy Washington's presentation about police profiling with loud coughing and whispered comments. The class held its breath, waiting for Mrs. Adams's response. "Mr. Thompson," she said, voice steel-sharp, "you've just volunteered to present next." She met his challenge head-on, finally embracing her role, not just as teacher, but as advocate for change. Brad's bravado crumbled under the spotlight. His attempt to make light of the assignment backfired when Kayla asked him directly, "Have you ever felt afraid to be yourself in this school?" The question pierced his armor. Stumbling, he admitted that his father's racism embarrassed him, that he sometimes laughed at offensive jokes to avoid becoming a target himself. This unexpected vulnerability transformed the classroom atmosphere. Other students began opening up about their own complicity in discrimination, their fears of challenging the status quo. The project's success attracted attention beyond Mrs. Adams's classroom. Other teachers requested to observe. Administrators took notice, and tension mounted as the school's social dynamics shifted. A group of students, led by Brad's friend Tyler, launched a counter-campaign. They plastered the halls with flyers mocking the presentations. Cry Club meeting in progress and professional victims anonymous. Kayla found cruel notes in her locker. Go back to remedial English where you belong. Jamila's hijab was pulled off in the hallway, the perpetrator disappearing into a laughing crowd. Mrs. Adams discovered the harassment when she overheard Kayla comforting a sobbing Jamila in the bathroom. The teacher's guilt over her past complacency transformed into fierce determination. She organized an emergency faculty meeting, presenting evidence of systemic discrimination within the school. Some colleagues defended the status quo, arguing that drawing attention to racism only created more division. Silence is what creates division, Mrs. Adams countered, surprising herself with her vehemence. These students are living these experiences whether we acknowledge them or not. Our silence makes us complicit. The conflict reached its peak during a school-wide assembly. Tyler's group planned to disrupt Kayla and Jamila's presentation about the project's impact. But as the girls began speaking, sharing stories that resonated across racial and social boundaries, something unexpected happened. Students started standing up, one by one, adding their voices. Athletes admitted to staying silent when teammates made racist jokes. Popular girls confessed to excluding classmates based on unexamined prejudices. Even Tyler, watching his supporters dwindle, began to question his opposition. The assembly transformed into an impromptu forum. Years of suppressed experiences and emotions poured out. Through tears and anger and eventual understanding, the school's carefully maintained facade of harmony cracked, revealing the possibility of genuine connection. Mrs. Adams stood with her students, finally embracing her role as an ally rather than a neutral observer. She shared her own journey of confronting internalized biases, modeling the vulnerability she'd asked of her students. The weeks following the assembly brought both backlash and breakthrough. While some parents demanded Mrs. Adams's dismissal, others rallied to support the changes she and her students had sparked. The school board meeting became a battleground. Conservative members argued that the Share Your Story project had created division where none existed before. But student after student testified about the impact of finally being heard. Kayla's presentation to the board demonstrated how the project had improved academic engagement and reduced disciplinary incidents. When students feel seen, she explained, they invest in their education differently. The administration ultimately not only protected the project but expanded it. Mrs. Adams developed a curriculum framework that other teachers could adapt, while Kayla and Jamila trained as peer facilitators. Brad, in an unexpected turn, became one of their strongest allies. His confrontation with his own prejudices led him to start a male athletes group focused on challenging toxic masculinity and racism in sports culture. The school's culture shifted gradually but unmistakably. Lunch tables grew more integrated. Students intervened when they witnessed discrimination. The annual talent show showcased diverse performances instead of the usual segregated acts. Mrs. Adams watched these changes with pride and humility. Her initial discomfort with Kayla's compliment had evolved into deep respect for her students' courage and wisdom. She learned to be not just an educator, but a student of their experiences. Kayla and Jamila flourished as leaders, mentoring younger students and organizing diversity workshops for other schools. Their friendship deepened through shared purpose, proving that meaningful change often starts with simple human connection. The following year, when a new student complimented Mrs. Adams's dress, she responded with genuine warmth and an invitation to share her own story. The cycle of transformation continued, each small interaction carrying the potential for greater understanding. The Share Your Story project became part of the school's legacy, a reminder that education's true power lies not just in textbooks, but in the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and grow through them together.